never thought I'd say this out loud, but I crossed a line I can never uncross. The affair I had wasn't just a mistake, it was with someone I was never supposed to touch. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. I never thought I would sit down to write something like this. To put into words the things I did, the choices I made, and the way I crossed a line I swore I never would. I'm not proud of what happened. In fact, a part of me is deeply ashamed. But another part of me, one I can't silence, remembers every detail with an intensity that refuses to fade. That's why I'm here, hiding behind anonymity, confessing to strangers what I've never dared to whisper to anyone in my real life. It all started in the most ordinary way. My daughter had been seeing this guy for a while, someone she met through her circle of friends at college. He was older than most of the kids she hung around with, closer to her mid-20s while she was just entering her 20s. His name isn't important here, so I'll leave it out, but I'll never forget the way he carried himself. Confident, relaxed, the kind of young man who walked into a room and immediately seemed to belong there. He had that charm that didn't come from trying too hard, it was just natural. The first time he came over to the house, I thought nothing of it. He was polite, shook my hand firmly, and even cracked a joke that made my wife laugh. He was respectful to my daughter, not the type of guy who looked like trouble, and at first I was relieved. You worry about who your kids are seeing, whether they're good enough, whether they'll treat them right. I didn't sense anything alarming in him. If anything, I felt a kind of ease. Too much ease, maybe, because it made me let down my guard. As weeks turned into months, he became a more regular presence in the house. Dinner nights, family gatherings, even helping out with little things like moving boxes or fixing something my daughter didn't have the patience for. That's when I started noticing things I hadn't before, or maybe I had, but I ignored them at first. The way he looked me in the eye when we talked. The subtle compliments he would drop into conversations, like he was testing me. You keep in good shape for your age, he said once while we were moving a heavy table together. I laughed it off, but inside, something stirred that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Then there was the way he listened. Most people nod along when you speak, but he actually listened. He'd ask follow-up questions, genuinely interested in my thoughts on music, sports, or even work. It was strange, because it had been a long time since someone had looked at me that way, with focus, with curiosity, like what I had to say actually mattered. My wife and I had been married for decades, and somewhere along the way, conversations between us had become more about logistics than connection. Bills, chores, schedules. Nothing wrong with that, but it left a void. A quiet, gnawing emptiness. And he seemed to sense it. The attraction wasn't immediate, it crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks you don't notice until the floor is already soaked. At first, I thought it was admiration. He reminded me of myself when I was younger, full of energy, easy with words, comfortable in his own skin. But admiration turned into curiosity. And curiosity became something darker. Something I tried to fight. The moment I realized it was more than harmless came one afternoon. He had come over to pick up my daughter, but she wasn't ready yet. Typical, she was still upstairs getting dressed, leaving the two of us in the living room. He sat casually on the couch, leaning back like he owned the space, while I busied myself pretending to tidy up. I caught myself stealing glances at him, his relaxed posture, the curve of a smirk on his lips as he scrolled through his phone. And then, as if he felt my eyes, he looked up. Our gazes locked for a second too long. Something electric passed between us, silent but undeniable. It shook me to my core. I remember excusing myself, muttering something about needing to grab something from the garage, just to escape that tension. My hands trembled as I picked up a wrench I didn't even need. I told myself it was a fluke, a trick of my imagination. But deep down, I knew. A line had been drawn in the sand, and sooner or later, I would cross it. After that, I became hyper-aware of him. His laugh, his voice, the way he carried himself. Every small detail was magnified. And what made it worse was the subtle ways he seemed to notice me, too. A playful shoulder bump when we passed in the hallway. A compliment about my cooking when I grilled outside. Little things that could have meant nothing, but to me, they meant everything. They were breadcrumbs, and I was following the trail even though I knew it led somewhere dangerous. At night, I lay in bed next to my wife, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with thoughts I didn't want to admit. I felt guilty, disgusted with myself, but also alive in a way I hadn't in years. It was like a storm had been brewing inside me, and he was the spark that set it off. I didn't know where it would end, but I knew it had already begun. Looking back, that was the start of everything. That slow, steady unraveling of boundaries I thought were unshakable. I didn't plan for it. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to risk everything for him. But temptation has a way of finding the cracks in your armor, and once it slips in, it's almost impossible to push out. And so, what began as innocent visits to my home slowly turned into something far more dangerous. Something I couldn't resist, no matter how hard I tried. The strange thing about temptation is how quietly it embeds itself into your life. One moment, everything feels ordinary, harmless, manageable. And then, without even realizing it, you've allowed something small to grow into something too big to control. That's exactly how it was with him. After that moment in the living room, when our eyes locked and something unspoken passed between us, I couldn't look at him the same way again. And I don't think he could either. The weeks that followed were filled with small, almost invisible shifts. Subtle, but enough that I noticed. Enough that I knew he noticed too. My daughter was often late when they planned to go out. She had a way of dragging her feet, spending extra time choosing outfits, fixing her hair, making him wait in the living room or the kitchen. And that waiting time became our time. At first, it was simple conversation. Music, sports, the kind of easy topics men fall back on when there's silence to fill. But beneath the words, there was something else. A current, a hum that neither of us named but both of us felt. One night, I came home later than usual from work. My wife was already upstairs, and I walked into the kitchen to find him there, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in his hand. My daughter hadn't come downstairs yet. He smirked when he saw me. "You work too much," he said, in that relaxed way of his. "You should let yourself breathe sometimes." It was a harmless comment on the surface, but the way he said it, the weight in his voice, the way his eyes held mine, made it feel like something else entirely. I brushed it off, chuckled, muttered something about responsibilities. But the truth was, my chest tightened. I felt seen in a way I hadn't for years. After that, the small gestures grew bolder. A hand on my shoulder that lingered a second too long. A laugh followed by a touch on my arm. Standing a little closer than necessary when we talked. All the kinds of things that could be dismissed as nothing if anyone else noticed, but to me, they were everything. They were fuel to a fire I couldn't put out. There was one moment that stands out, burned into my memory. My daughter had asked him to help carry some heavy boxes up from the garage. I joined in, because two sets of hands made the work easier. At one point, while maneuvering a particularly large box, our arms brushed, then our sides pressed together as we tried to fit through the narrow doorway. It was nothing, really. But in that second, I felt the warmth of his body against mine. I felt the strength in him. And when I looked up, he was already looking at me. His lips curved into that faint, knowing smile. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. It was intent. That night, lying awake, I told myself it had to stop. That I was a fool to even entertain these thoughts. That I was risking too much, even letting them live in my head. But the more I tried to suppress them, the stronger they became. I'd find myself replaying little interactions, analyzing them, twisting them into something more. His laugh when he leaned back on the couch. The way his hand brushed mine when we both reached for the same serving spoon at dinner. The way he called me, sir, sometimes, teasingly, like he knew it got under my skin. And maybe he did know. Maybe he could see through me more than I realized. Because one evening, when my wife was out visiting a friend and my daughter was running late, it happened. He was already at the house, waiting in the kitchen again. I offered him a beer, and we sat at the table, talking about nothing in particular. But as the minutes stretched, the space between us seemed to shrink. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on mine. "You're different when it's just the two of us," he said quietly. My throat went dry. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. He shrugged, smirking like he had all the time in the world. "Just, you let yourself relax. You don't pretend as much." It was the kind of statement that hit harder than it should. Because it was true. Around him, I felt like I could breathe in a way I couldn't with anyone else. I didn't have to keep up the role of husband, father, provider. I could just be. And the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered, I knew he wasn't just making an observation. He was testing me, waiting to see how I'd react. Before I could say anything more, my daughter came rushing in, apologizing for being late. The spell was broken, the tension dissolved in an instant. But the seed had already been planted. We had crossed into territory that couldn't be ignored. From then on, I started to crave those stolen moments when she wasn't around. I told myself I was just imagining it, that he wasn't actually flirting, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew better. The way he looked at me. The pauses in conversation that lingered too long. The smirk that seemed to say, I know exactly what you're thinking. Lines that should have remained clear had begun to blur. And I was no longer sure I wanted to keep them straight. I don't know when exactly I lost control. Maybe it wasn't one single moment. Maybe it was a series of small decisions, tiny cracks in my resolve, that eventually split wide open. But if I had to choose a point, the exact instant I crossed a line I could never uncross, it was the night of the first kiss. It was late on a Friday. My wife had gone to bed early, exhausted from the week. My daughter had gone out with friends, leaving him at the house. He claimed he wanted to wait for her rather than meet her later. I didn't think much of it. At least, I pretended not to. Deep down, I knew what it meant. Maybe I even wanted it. We were in the living room, a couple of beers between us, a muted game flickering on the TV. We talked, laughed, let the conversation drift from topic to topic. At some point, the air shifted. It's hard to describe, but it was as if the words stopped mattering and the silence between them carried more weight. He leaned closer when he spoke, his arm draped across the back of the couch behind me. I felt the warmth of him. I smelled the faint trace of his cologne mixed with the hops of the beer. My heart pounded in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told myself to stand up, to break the moment, to get water or pretend I was tired. But I didn't. I stayed rooted to the spot, paralyzed and drawn in at the same time. Then he said something that undid me completely. You know, I think about you more than I should. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if he didn't want the walls to hear. The room spun. My throat went dry. My first instinct was denial. What are you talking about? I asked, but my voice betrayed me. It wasn't firm, it wasn't fatherly. It was shaky, curious, hungry. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted closer, so close that our knees brushed. His eyes held mine, steady, unwavering. Don't pretend you don't feel it too, he said softly. In that instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. The muted TV, the quiet hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the faint creaks of the house, all of it faded. It was just him and me, caught in a magnetic pull that neither of us could deny any longer. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words never came. Because the moment I did, he closed the distance. His lips pressed against mine, firm, deliberate, unapologetic. The shock of it was overwhelming. My whole body jolted, not from resistance but from the sheer intensity of the sensation. His lips were warm, insistent, and my heart slammed against my ribcage. For a fraction of a second, I froze. I could have pulled away. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back. It was clumsy at first, desperate, like two people who had been holding back for too long and finally let go. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I let him. My own hands betrayed me, gripping his shirt as if I was afraid he might disappear. The taste of beer mixed with something sweeter, something forbidden, and it consumed me. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, the weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. I stared at him, my chest heaving, my mind a storm of guilt and desire. We can't, I started, but the words were hollow. He smirked, his thumb brushing the corner of my mouth as if to erase the evidence. We already did. I should have felt nothing but shame. And yes, it was there, a heavy, gnawing guilt that clawed at me. But alongside it, stronger and harder to ignore, was exhilaration. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Desired. Seen. It was intoxicating, and I knew even then that one taste would never be enough. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped us out of it. My daughter was back. We sprang apart like guilty teenagers, my heart racing as she walked through the door, oblivious to the storm that had just erupted in her own living room. I plastered on a smile, greeted her casually, while inside, I was unraveling. That night, lying in bed beside my wife, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his lips again. I replayed the moment over and over, searching for a way to make sense of it. Part of me wanted to convince myself it was a mistake, a lapse, something that would never happen again. But another part knew the truth. It wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The kiss had shattered the thin wall we'd been hiding behind. The lines that had blurred were now completely gone. We had crossed over, and there was no going back. From that night on, every glance, every brush of a hand, every stolen second carried new meaning. We were no longer pretending. We were no longer dancing around what we both wanted. We were moving toward it, inevitably, dangerously, recklessly. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to call it wrong, to cling to the safety of my old life, I couldn't. Because deep inside, I craved more. The kiss should have scared me straight. It should have been the shock I needed to pull back, to cut things off before they spiraled further. But instead, it became fuel. Once that barrier was broken, there was no putting it back together. Every time I saw him after that night, the memory of his lips on mine haunted me. It wasn't just temptation anymore, it was hunger. And hunger doesn't just vanish, it grows. At first, we tried to pretend nothing had changed. Around my daughter, around my wife, we acted normal. Harmless conversations, casual laughter, but beneath the surface, everything was charged. A brush of his hand against mine when he handed me a glass. His knee touching mine when we sat side by side. The way his gaze lingered across the dinner table. Every tiny interaction became a secret, silent conversation of its own. The first time we were truly alone again happened by chance. My daughter had gone out for a weekend trip with her friends. My wife was working late, covering an extra shift. He stopped by, under the excuse of picking something up my daughter had forgotten. I should have handed it to him at the door, waved goodbye, and shut it behind him. But I didn't. I let him in. We didn't even make it to the living room. The moment the door clicked shut, he stepped closer. I felt his breath before his lips touched mine. It wasn't tentative this time, it was urgent, almost rough, as though we'd both been waiting for this exact moment. My back hit the wall, his hands gripping my sides, and I didn't resist. I gave in, melting into the heat of it, kissing him like I'd been starved. It's impossible to explain the intensity of that night without sounding reckless or insane. I'd been married for years. I had a routine, a life that was stable, predictable. And yet, with him, everything was electric. Every touch, every sound, every secret breath we shared felt amplified. My guilt screamed at me even as my body betrayed me, pulling him closer, desperate for more. When it was over, we sat side by side on the couch, silent, catching our breath. I stared at the floor, shame pressing down on me, but at the same time, I couldn't fight the grin tugging at my lips. He noticed it, of course. He always noticed everything. "You're overthinking," he murmured, sliding his hand over mine. "Just let yourself enjoy it." But that was the problem, I couldn't just enjoy it. Every stolen moment with him was double-edged, pleasure laced with poison. I wanted him more than I'd ever admit, but I also feared what it meant. What if someone found out? What if my daughter noticed the tension between us? What if my wife caught even a glimpse of what was really happening? The risks were unthinkable, and yet, I still let it continue. Our affair unfolded like shadows slipping into the night. We became masters of subtlety. Texts disguised as harmless check-ins. Quick visits under flimsy excuses. Late-night drives where he'd say he needed to talk, and I'd climb into his car, knowing full well talking was the last thing on either of our minds. There was one night I'll never forget. The house was quiet, my wife asleep upstairs, my daughter staying at a friend's. He came over under the pretense of dropping something off. We ended up in the kitchen, whispers bouncing off the tile walls, laughter hushed but uncontrollable. Then, in the glow of the dim light above the stove, he kissed me again. It was dangerous, reckless, she could have walked down at any moment, but that only made it more intoxicating. Every second carried the thrill of being caught, and yet, we didn't stop. The secrecy bled into every part of my life. I'd lie in bed at night, my wife breathing steadily beside me, while I replayed his touch in my mind. I'd go through the motions of family dinners, smiling and nodding, while under the table his knee pressed against mine, and the world outside ceased to exist. My life had split into two halves, the one everyone saw, and the one I lived in the shadows. The guilt was constant, gnawing, relentless. But so was the desire. And desire has a way of drowning out everything else when it's strong enough. I found myself planning around him, anticipating when I might see him, inventing reasons to be alone together. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. There was a moment one evening when I almost confessed. We were lying side by side in the dark of his car, parked at the edge of a quiet street, the windows fogged from our breath. I turned to him, words bubbling up, ready to spill everything, the guilt, the fear, the shame. But he silenced me with a kiss, and just like that, the words vanished. He had a way of doing that, pulling me back into the fire whenever I tried to step away. By the time weeks turned into months, our affair had become a rhythm of its own. A hidden song only the two of us knew, playing beneath the noise of everyday life. I told myself it couldn't last, that it would burn out eventually, that I'd find the strength to end it. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I wasn't ready to give him up. Not yet, maybe not ever. And so, the nights of secrecy continued. Every kiss, every whispered promise, every stolen touch etched deeper into me. I was living on borrowed time, I knew that much. But when I was with him, none of it mattered. In those moments, there was no guilt, no fear, just the undeniable pull of something I couldn't resist. It was dangerous, it was wrong, but it was ours. There are some secrets that carve themselves into you so deeply, they become part of who you are. You carry them everywhere, not because you want to, but because you can't ever let them out. That's what this has become for me. A secret that has lived in my veins for years, shaping me in ways I still don't fully understand. It didn't end with some dramatic confrontation. My wife never found out. My daughter never suspected. The affair never came crashing down in flames like you'd expect in a movie. No, our ending was quieter, more complicated, and in many ways, harder to bear. Over time, life shifted. My daughter moved on, eventually breaking things off with him, though not because of me. She simply outgrew the relationship, ready for something different. He and I saw each other less after that. Fewer excuses to cross paths. Fewer chances to steal moments. Our affair faded, not because either of us wanted it to, but because circumstances left us no room to continue. But here's the thing, even when the physical part stopped, the memory of it didn't. It lingers, heavy, bittersweet. Every kiss, every secret night, every reckless decision is etched into me like scars I can't show anyone. Do I regret it? That's the question I wrestle with most. If you ask me as a husband, as a father, as the man people believe me to be, the answer should be yes. I should regret every second. I should condemn myself for betraying my wife, for betraying the trust of my own family. And part of me does. There are nights I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I could have let myself fall so far. But if you ask the man who lived those moments, the man who felt alive in ways he hadn't in decades, the answer is different. Because as wrong as it was, as dangerous, as reckless, it was also real. More real than anything I had felt in years. He made me feel seen, desired, awake. Those aren't things you can simply erase, no matter how much you wish you could. That's why I remain anonymous. That's why I write this here, confessing to strangers rather than speaking aloud to anyone who knows me. Because this is the only way I can let it out. The only way I can admit the truth without tearing my world apart. Sometimes, I catch myself looking back on those nights with a kind of quiet ache. Not just for him, but for who I was when I was with him. A man who wasn't trapped in routine. A man who wasn't just a husband, a father, a provider. A man who let himself feel reckless, passionate, desired. It was a dangerous version of me, yes, but it was also the most alive I've felt in years. The hardest part is the silence. I see my wife every day, sharing meals, sharing a bed, sharing a life. And she has no idea. She'll never know the things I did, the lines I crossed, the secrets I keep locked away. And my daughter, she still remembers him as just another boyfriend, someone from her past. She'll never know what he became to me. And that's how it has to stay. Because some truths would destroy everything. I live with that knowledge every day. I carry the weight of it quietly, invisibly, pretending to be the man everyone thinks I am. Sometimes the guilt is unbearable. Other times, the memory of his touch is enough to drown out everything else. It's a strange, twisted duality, shame and desire, guilt and longing, coexisting inside me like two sides of the same coin. If there's a lesson in all this, it's not a neat or comforting one. I can't sit here and say, don't make the same mistake I did, because the truth is, part of me doesn't see it as a mistake at all. It was wrong, yes. But it was also human. We're all vulnerable. We all crave connection, intimacy, to be seen. And sometimes, when those needs aren't met in the places they should be, we look for them elsewhere, even if, elsewhere, is the most forbidden place imaginable. I'm not proud of it. But I won't deny it either. This is my truth, messy as it is. So I remain anonymous. A nameless man, confessing to the void. Maybe you'll judge me. Maybe you'll understand. Maybe you'll feel a flicker of recognition, because temptation doesn't care who you are or what you have to lose. It finds you when you least expect it, and once it does, nothing is ever quite the same again. This was my secret, my hunger, My fire. And though the flame has gone out, the burn marks are still there, etched into me forever. A married man confesses his forbidden affair with his daughter's boyfriend, a secret that never came to light but left scars he carries forever. Torn between guilt and longing, he reflects on passion, betrayal, and the dangerous truth of what it means to feel alive again. Some affairs don't end with explosive revelations, they fade into silence, buried beneath layers of guilt and secrecy. But silence doesn't erase what happened. For this man, the affair with his daughter's boyfriend was both his greatest mistake and his deepest hunger. It awakened something he thought he had lost, yet condemned him to a lifetime of secrecy. In the end, no one ever knew, except him. And that is the heaviest kind of confession, the one you carry alone. Some affairs stay buried, but the scars never fade. This was my truth, raw, forbidden, and unforgettable. If you think this story was shocking, trust me, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe now, because the darkest secrets are yet to come. Disclaimer. This story is a work of anonymous confession and dramatization, created for mature audiences only. It is intended for entertainment and storytelling purposes. Names, details, and events may be altered to protect privacy. Viewer discretion is advised.